Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway from the Garrison Church of God. Normally, we have Dickens this time of the year, but because of the COVID, we're not having it. But our church was doing something special, so I'm dressed up for Dickens today. But I hope you're enjoying your Christmas season. We love the Christmas season at our church and enjoy that. We'd like to invite you to come and be a part of our services. We begin on Sunday at 8:30 at Riverdale Community Church in Riverdale. And then we have service here in Garrison at 10:30 in the morning, and we'd like to invite you to be a part of either of these two services. I love the Advent season. I love this time of the year, this time to celebrate Jesus Christ coming into the world. I hope you're celebrating Him. I hope you're enjoying this Christmas season. Behind you, you can see that we have our church decorated for Christmas, and this is always a wonderful, wonderful season of the year. This is the second Sunday of Advent, and as I mentioned last Sunday, I absolutely love the Advent season. It's a wonderful time of the year. This Sunday generally deals with the concept of obedience. And Joseph is sort of the main character for this time when we think about obedience unto God. I want to be talking to you this Sunday about the call, and it comes from Isaiah chapter 7 and beginning in verse 10. And this concept of the call in our lives is extremely important. We are called to obedience and service. Isaiah in chapter 6 of Isaiah has his calling. It is a tremendous calling by God, and we don't know exactly when this took place. We do know that it took place in the year that King Uzziah died. And we believe that is probably around the year 740 BC. But in Isaiah's life, we don't know exactly when that event took place. Likely it took place somewhere between his 13th year and his 16th year. Isaiah is quite an interesting man. He came from a wealthy, powerful family. He was a scion of probably the family of David, or possibly a scion also of the priestly family. His mother may well have been the king's sister. King Jotham was the king at this time. King Uzziah was set aside because he had leprosy, and so he had to remain in a segregated location. And his son Jotham actually was ruling the nation of Judah at the time. It was a very interesting time in world history, a very complex time. The Assyrian Empire had risen to power, but as a result of some problems in their nation, they had gone into a period of decline for 2 kings. And that period of decline lasted for quite a long time, through much of King Uzziah's reign. Near his death, however, Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne of Assyria. He would usurp the throne for himself and establish a new dynasty. That usurpation led to a reinvigoration of the Assyrian Empire. And they began to once again spread out and began to once again conquer other parts of the world. And they set their sights actually on the area of Palestine, or what we now know as Palestine. And it became a difficult and painful time. Many of the kings around Judah built an alliance during this time against Assyria. You had the Egyptians, you had the Philistines, you had the Phoenicians, you had also the building of a powerful coalition of Syria and part of northern Israel. Northern Israel during this time was split between 2 rival kings, but during this time there was an attempt to build a coalition. King Jotham, who was the king during Isaiah's growing up years, walked a tightrope between these two great empires, between the Egyptians and the Assyrians. He was always at odds somewhat with the northern kingdom and with the Syrians, who desperately wanted him to join the alliance. When his son Ahaz, who was about the same age as Isaiah, in fact, they probably grew up together. Isaiah was in and out of the palace. He knew the palace very well and didn't have any problems moving in and out of that. He also knew the temple. And in chapter 6 of Isaiah, where he has his call, he is actually sitting in the temple, looking at the temple when Uzziah dies. And if he was a member of the royal family, Uzziah may well have been his grandfather. And so he may have experienced all of the difficult problems that brought. Ahaz grew up angry with his parents, and at 12 years of age, he was married by his father to the high priest's daughter. She was probably close to his own age. She would bear a son, Hezekiah, and Hezekiah would be only 12 to 13 years his father's junior. So it was a difficult circumstance, and it had to do with all the political situations that were going on around them. It was a terrible time in Judah's history. When Ahaz came to the throne at 20 years of age, he came during a time of upheaval. He turned his face toward the Assyrians, which angered particularly the nation of Syria, or as it was called, Aramea at the time, and angered the northern kingdom of Israel, which had been unified under King Pekah. That left a huge problem. They immediately attacked the nation of Judah, and Ahaz was in very serious straits. A large portion of the Jewish army was captured, and it talks about the hearts of the people being like the branches of trees being swayed back and forth by the wind. And so there's a lot of concern and frustration. And in chapter 7, Isaiah, who's just married evidently and has his own children and has a newborn infant, brings that newborn infant to Ahaz and says to him, "Listen, God has promised that he will protect our nation in the midst of this. You can trust God." And Ahaz basically looks at Isaiah and says, well, whatever. God may or may not take care of us. I'm not too concerned about it, because Ahaz had already had a plan of his own. He was going to strip the temple bare of its treasuries and hire King Tiglath-Pileser to come and rescue him from the Syrians and from northern Israel. He was going to make a treaty. We know that this actually happened because Tiglath-Pileser's summary of his history tells about the submission of King Ahaz to him, and tells about the money and the gold and silver from the temple that he sent to buy him off. The writer of 2 Chronicles tells us that it really didn't do a whole lot of good, because Tiglath-Pileser didn't really care too much whether he honored the basis of the contract or not. The Syrians and northern Israel did withdraw because they were indeed concerned about the Assyrians. There's a lot of struggle in our lives over whether we should obey God or not. And Ahaz basically says, when Isaiah says to him, choose any sign you want from God, and God will grant it. And Ahaz smugly says, well, why should I trouble God in this matter? I'm fine. And God speaks through Isaiah and says to him, why do you, O house of David, trouble me? Let me tell you that I will give you a sign. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. In addition to this, that before this child, and he's talking about his own child, is able to discern right from wrong, or as we would say, before he reaches the age of 12, the two kings that you worry about, the Syrians and the people of northern Israel, will be no more. And that certainly happened before his son would have reached the age of 12. Both northern Israel and Syria, or Damascus, were destroyed by the Assyrians. So that prophecy did come true. Ahaz was not obedient. He was one of the most wicked kings that Judah ever knew. It would be his son Hezekiah that would change the direction of the nation. And it would be a descendant many centuries down the road that would accept the responsibility of obedience. A Jewish carpenter by the name of Joseph, who was Ahaz's descendant, he would accept that calling to obedience. It is interesting that God chose a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, to be the one who would raise the Messiah. That is a powerful thing to me. We would have expected the Messiah to be born in the house of an academic, or the house of a priest, or the house of someone who was powerful or influential, or even a major ruler. But God chose to put him in the house of a carpenter, to grow up learning the trade of carpentry, to work with his hands. God, for some reason, felt this was important for Jesus to learn. It's a powerful lesson to us about the things that are ultimately important. To learn a trade, one must discipline themselves. One must learn the skills. Working in a trade is a person who must learn, by the basic structure of the trade, obedience. God calls us to obedience. He calls us to discipline, to self-discipline. And that is what Jesus learned as he grew up, the discipline of a trade. I hope you have learned self-discipline. I hope that is a part of your life. Joseph was a man that God chose to raise the Messiah because he was a man of obedience and discipline. Merry Christmas. I hope you have a wonderful Advent season. God's blessings.